Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. It started on a Sunday afternoon, a day like any other. I was in our bedroom, organizing a drawer, shuffling through the chaos of old receipts, stray pins, and forgotten trinkets. That's when I found it. His old phone. The one he'd used before we had upgraded to the newer model. It had been tucked away, shoved in the back of the drawer, untouched for months. I knew he'd probably forgotten about it. He didn't even remember where he'd left it, not that long ago. But I did. Something in me, the curiosity, maybe the boredom of the day, made me pause. The phone was sleek, older, but still functional. I turned it over in my hands, absent-mindedly wondering why he hadn't gotten rid of it. It didn't take much to power it on. He hadn't bothered to reset it or lock it with a password. The screen lit up as though waiting for me to do something with it. I shouldn't have, I know. Maybe it was a violation of his privacy. But curiosity tugged at me, a magnetic pull. I was always the type to respect boundaries, but there was something about this phone that felt like it held answers to questions I hadn't even known to ask. I scrolled through his apps, nothing unusual. Photos, messages, nothing that stood out. But then I saw it. There, in the corner of the screen, a folder that wasn't in any of his other phones. The name of the folder was simple, but strangely compelling. Memories. It wasn't like him to be sentimental. He'd never kept a lot of old photos. He never talked about his past, except in vague terms. There were no old friends that I knew of, no real history before me. Everything started with me, I thought, or so I had believed. But this folder, this was different. It didn't belong in the forgotten corners of a drawer. It was personal. It wasn't the kind of thing you hid from someone unless there was something worth hiding. A pit formed in my stomach as I clicked it open. My heart raced in anticipation, and the moment the first image appeared, I was hooked. It wasn't just a picture. It was a glimpse into a life I hadn't known existed. There he was, my husband, smiling at a camera I didn't recognize, surrounded by people I'd never seen before. His eyes, wild, almost feral, were not the eyes of the man I knew. It wasn't the first photo either. More pictures filled the screen, one after another, each one more puzzling than the last. A younger him, unrecognizable to me. His face painted with something darker, something dangerous. The people around him were dressed in strange, provocative attire. The setting looked like a club, dimly lit, the air thick with tension. His pose, his body language, was all wrong. This was not the man who held me at night, who whispered loving words as he slept beside me. I couldn't look away. The images kept coming. His eyes locked on the camera, his expression shifting, serious, hungry, intense, and I felt it in my chest. An ache, a gnawing uncertainty. Was this who he had been? Was this some kind of forgotten part of his past that he had never shared with me? And if so, why? I was about to scroll to the next photo when something made me stop. In the background, barely visible, was a woman. She was standing close to him, but the photo was blurry. It was a woman with long dark hair and an intense gaze. I couldn't make out her face fully, but her presence stood out, like she belonged there. And suddenly, my pulse quickened. Something told me this wasn't just a collection of old memories. This was a part of him I had never known. A part of his past that was still buried under layers of secrets. The questions were endless now, and I hadn't even scratched the surface. I stared at the screen, the images slowly scrolling one after another, each more baffling than the last. Who was this man in these photos? He wasn't the man I had married. Not even close. The phone vibrated in my hands as if it were alive, daring me to keep looking. My eyes, wide with disbelief, traced every detail. His posture, his expression, the way he seemed to fit in with these strangers. There was an energy in these photos, a rawness, a freedom that I didn't recognize. I wanted to look away, but the urge to understand, to know the truth, anchored me in place. The photos were taken in various settings. The lighting was always dim, soft, casting shadows over the people in them, emphasizing the mystery in their eyes. I tried to make sense of it all. Why had he kept these photos hidden away? Why hadn't he ever spoken about this part of his life? Had he simply outgrown it, or was there more to it? As I swiped through the images, a sense of unease crept over me. This wasn't just a casual hobby or something that was in his past. These photos spoke of a world, of people and experiences that felt dangerous, secretive. It was as though I had stumbled upon a side of him that had been carefully tucked away, hidden from my sight. I tried to process the growing confusion in my mind. The man I knew, the man I loved, didn't fit with the person I was seeing in these pictures. Was he living a double life? Had I unknowingly married someone who was living with a lie? My mind raced as I tried to piece together the fragments of his past. The thoughts came at me like a storm. In one photo, he was standing in front of a door, holding it open. Behind him, a figure was bent over, the blurred outline of ropes tied around them. It wasn't explicit, but the implications were clear. This was more than a party. This was a world of submission, of dominance, of something dark that I had never imagined he could be part of. A part of me wanted to scream, to confront him right there and then. But another part of me feared what the truth might bring. Could I handle the truth of who he was before me? And more importantly, would it change everything I thought I knew about us? As I put the phone down, I felt sick, dizzy. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that I was looking at a stranger's life, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know anymore. I sat there, in our bedroom, the phone still lying on my lap, a bridge to a past I had no part in. I didn't know what to do with what I had seen. The curiosity that had initially drawn me in now felt like a curse. Why had I opened that folder? Why had I crossed that line? But it was too late. I could still see the images in my mind, could feel the weight of their secrets pressing down on me. The folder had been labeled memories, and yet it held nothing but questions. I had found it by accident, but now that it was there, it felt like the missing piece of a puzzle that I hadn't even known I was trying to solve. The problem was, I didn't know how to face him now. How could I confront him with something so personal, something so raw? And why hadn't he told me about it? Did he think I wouldn't understand? Did he think I'd judge him? My mind kept coming back to that word, secrets. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something wasn't adding up. If this was just a part of his past, why'd he kept it so hidden? And why did it feel like there was so much more to this story that I hadn't yet uncovered? I picked up the phone again, but this time, I hesitated. Should I keep going? Should I keep looking at things that might make my stomach turn? Things that might destroy everything I thought I knew about him? The decision felt impossible, but the curiosity was stronger than my fear. Slowly, I opened the album again, hoping for answers. The next photo that loaded was of him, standing alone in front of what looked like a dimly lit bar. He was dressed in black leather, the kind of attire I had never seen him wear before. It was tight, restrictive, and it gave him an air of dominance, of power. His expression was hard to read, but there was something confident, even intimidating, about the way he held himself. This wasn't the man I had married. In the background, a few other people were visible. They were all dressed similarly, their faces obscured by the shadows, but their presence made the photo feel like a scene from another world, one I couldn't even begin to understand. I sat back, overwhelmed. This wasn't just some fleeting phase. This was an entire life, a life he hadn't shared with me. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to feel. All I knew was that I was afraid of what was coming next. The photos were like pieces of a broken mirror, each one showing a different reflection of a man I thought I knew, but didn't. It was as though I was learning that the person I married, the one I loved, wasn't the person he had always been. As I continued scrolling, I felt more and more disconnected from the man in these photos. His friends, the people around him, seemed so foreign. They were all part of this world that was so far removed from the life we had built together. Their faces were unfamiliar, yet they all seemed to belong to him in ways that I couldn't comprehend. Some of the faces were blurred, hidden in the background, but others stood out, laughing, drinking, playing games. But it wasn't a fun, carefree energy. It was darker, more charged. There was a sense of intimacy in these moments that felt strange to me, like they shared something I could never be a part of. It made me feel like an outsider in my own marriage. One image stood out to me more than the others. It was a shot of a group of people gathered together, and in the center, there was my husband, sitting on a chair. His posture was commanding, as though he was the leader of the group. The people around him were either kneeling or standing attentively. His eyes were locked onto the camera, and there was a darkness in them that made me shiver. I couldn't place it, this feeling that washed over me. It was like I had crossed into a world where rules didn't apply, where things were decided by power and control. The kind of world that had never once crossed my mind when I thought about my husband. What was he hiding from me? What was this world he had been a part of, and why had he kept it from me for so long? I couldn't stop asking myself these questions, but the answers weren't coming. Then, in the next photo, there he was again. My husband, only this time. It was clear he was no longer just a participant in this world. He was in control. The way he held himself, the way he commanded attention, made him look like a completely different person. This wasn't the man I had married, the gentle, caring husband I knew. This was someone who had found something in himself, something powerful and unsettling. I studied the photo, and a chill ran down my spine. The room around him was dark, the only light coming from a few candles scattered on a table. In the background, shadows moved, but my focus was entirely on him. His expression was calm, even serene, but his eyes told a different story. They were hard, calculating, and yet there was a vulnerability in them too, like he was exposing a part of himself that he couldn't hide. How could this be the same man I lived with? The man who brought me flowers, who held me at night, who whispered in my ear how much he loved me. The more I looked at these photos, the more I realized that I didn't know him at all. I didn't know who he had been, and now I was terrified of what he might still be hiding. This was a side of him I wasn't sure I could ever understand or forgive. As I scrolled further through the album, a particular image caught my attention. It wasn't just my husband's face this time. It was the woman standing next to him. She was dressed in a striking red dress, her body language exuding a confidence that matched his own. Her expression was intense, almost challenging, and the chemistry between them was undeniable. I felt a pang of something unfamiliar, a knot forming in my stomach. There was something about her that seemed too close, too familiar. Her proximity to him was unsettling. In the photo, he was standing just a little too close, their eyes locking in a way that felt intimate, private, as if the whole world had faded away and it was just the two of them. My fingers hovered over the screen. I had to know who she was. Why had he never mentioned her to me? Was she just another face from his past, or was there more to it? The question spiraled in my mind. I zoomed in on the photo, trying to capture every detail. The woman had dark, flowing hair, a sharp jawline, and eyes that sparkled with mischief. She wasn't just someone passing through his life. She was someone important, someone who seemed to have a hold on him. But who was she? And why had he never spoken about her? As I looked closer, the realization hit me. This wasn't just a fleeting interaction. The connection between them was deeper, more complex. There was history here, something far beyond a casual acquaintance. My heart raced as I considered the possibility that this woman wasn't just part of his past. She might still be part of his present. I slammed the phone down onto the bed, unable to look at it any longer. The woman in red haunted me, her presence lingering in my mind. Who was she? And why had my husband never mentioned her to me? Why hadn't he shared this part of his life with me? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that there were things he hadn't just hidden from me. They were things he had chosen to keep buried. And now, I was starting to understand why. The woman in red had left me shaken, but it was just the beginning. I couldn't stop thinking about the things my husband had kept hidden from me, things that I had never even considered before. He had always been so private, so closed off when it came to his past. But now I was starting to see that there was so much more to him than I had ever known. Why had he kept these parts of his life hidden? Why had he never shared them with me? I felt like I was being led through a maze, and each turn was revealing another layer of him that I wasn't prepared to see. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't have a choice. I needed to know the truth. I couldn't just ignore the evidence anymore. His past, the BDSM club, the people in his life, the woman in red, everything was connected. And yet, it felt like he had built a wall between us, a wall made of secrets. Secrets I was only beginning to unravel. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had changed in such a short time. How had I gotten here? How had I gone from a woman in love, secure in her relationship, to someone who didn't even recognize her husband anymore? The man in those photos, the one who was part of that world, seemed so distant, so far removed from the man I had married. I wanted to believe that he had changed, that he was a different person now. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore what I had seen. The truth was right in front of me, and I was no longer willing to pretend that everything was okay. I needed to confront him. I needed to ask the questions that had been plaguing me. But what if the answers were more than I could handle? What if the truth was something I couldn't live with? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending that I didn't see the cracks in our relationship. The walls he had built between us were too high now, and it was time to tear them down. It was late afternoon when I finally decided that enough was enough. I had spent days trying to piece together the fragments of his past, but I knew it was time to hear it from him. I had to confront him, no matter how terrifying that thought was. He was sitting in the living room when I walked in, his eyes flicking up briefly before he returned to his phone. He looked so ordinary, so calm, but I knew what was coming. The weight of the moment hung between us, like a thick fog that neither of us could avoid. I took a deep breath. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. He looked at me then, his face shifting as he recognized the seriousness in my tone. "About what?" he asked, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. "About your past," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "About the things you've kept hidden from me." His expression shifted, the calm facade cracking. He set his phone down slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but there was a flicker of guilt in his eyes. I wasn't buying it. "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice breaking. "I saw the photos. I saw everything. The club, the woman, all of it." His face went pale, and for a moment, I thought he might say something, explain himself. But instead, he fell silent, his gaze drifting away. "I never wanted you to find out," he said quietly. "It was a part of my life I thought was behind me, a part of me I buried. I didn't want you to see that side of me." His words hung in the air, but they didn't bring me any comfort. If anything, they made it worse. He had buried this part of himself, hidden it from me, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I didn't understand. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you trust me with the truth?" He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes haunted. "I was afraid," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Afraid that you wouldn't love me anymore. Afraid that you'd leave me." But the truth was, I was already leaving. Emotionally, at least. I could feel the distance between us growing with every word he spoke. Days passed since the confrontation, and yet I felt further away from him than ever. The man I had thought I knew seemed to be slipping through my fingers, leaving only fragments of the person I had once loved. Our conversations had become shallow, distant. He would try to reach out, to comfort me, but it felt hollow. I couldn't look at him without seeing the man in those photos, without seeing the secrets he had kept buried for so long. The walls between us felt insurmountable. I didn't know how to move forward. I couldn't go back to the way things were, not after everything I had learned. But I also didn't know how to let go. The love I had for him was still there, buried deep inside me, but it was overshadowed by the truth that now hung over us. I spent more time alone, reflecting on everything. The images, the memories, the lies. Everything was swirling in my mind. I needed space. I needed clarity. And yet, every time I thought about leaving, something inside me hesitated. I loved him, but could I ever trust him again? Could I ever live with the knowledge of who he had been? The distance between us grew with every passing day, until it felt like we were living in two separate worlds. It had been weeks since I found the phone, and the strain was beginning to show in every aspect of our life together. The tension between us was palpable, like a constant hum in the air, always there, always pressing. He would try to reassure me, to tell me that he was still the man I had married, but the words felt empty. I couldn't erase what I had seen, couldn't forget the photos, the woman in red, the world he had been a part of. I tried to focus on the mundane things, the small acts of daily life. But everything felt heavy, like I was dragging myself through a life I no longer recognized. I kept asking myself why I couldn't just move on, why I couldn't let go of the man I had once known. But the truth was, I was afraid of what I might find if I did. I was afraid that I would lose myself in the process, that I would become just another person in his past, lost to time and secrets. I didn't know what was worse, living in the silence of our strained relationship or facing the truth of who he really was. The guilt weighed heavily on me, more so than the anger. Every time I looked at him, I saw the man who had hidden his past from me, the man who had made decisions I couldn't understand. I couldn't help but wonder, was he still that man? Could he ever truly change? I tried to push those questions aside, to focus on the good times, the reasons I fell in love with him. But the past had a way of creeping back in, and no matter how much I tried to silence it, it kept resurfacing. It was always there, lurking just below the surface. I began to question myself too. Why was I still here? What was I waiting for? Was it hope that he would change, or was it something else? Did I want him to change? Or did I want him to be the man I had married, the man I had believed him to be? I had asked him about his past, and he had told me as much as he could, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there were things left unsaid, things he still wasn't ready to face. There was a part of me that wanted him to open up completely, to lay everything on the table, but another part of me feared what might come out. Would I be able to handle the full truth? Or would it break me? The guilt gnawed at me. It wasn't just about the photos or the secrets. It was about the fact that we had lost something, something important. Our connection, the trust we once shared, seemed irreparably broken. And every time I thought about trying to rebuild it, I was struck with the realization that it might never be the same again. I had to make a choice, and I knew it. Stay and try to fix what was broken, or walk away and leave the past behind. But the decision wasn't easy. The love was still there, but so was the pain. And I wasn't sure which one would win out in the end. One evening, as I sat in the kitchen, trying to focus on something other than the mess my life had become, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around. "I'm sorry." His voice was soft, almost fragile. "I should have told you. I should have never kept these things from you." I paused, my hands frozen mid-motion. He had never apologized like this before. It wasn't just an apology for the past. It was an apology for the hurt he had caused, the trust he had broken. It felt different, genuine, even. I finally turned to face him, my heart racing. His eyes were filled with regret, the weight of everything pressing down on him. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that he was sorry, that this was a turning point, that we could move forward from all of this. But the truth was, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if I could forgive him for everything I had discovered, for all the things he had hidden from me. I wasn't sure if I could forget. "I don't know how to move past this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I can." He reached for my hand, but I pulled it back, not because I didn't want him to touch me, but because I didn't know what I felt anymore. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I want to try, if you'll let me." I stared at him for a long time, searching his eyes for any sign that this was real, that his apology wasn't just words. But all I saw was the man I had once loved, the man who had shattered my trust. Could I forgive him? Could I rebuild everything we had lost? The answer didn't come easily, but deep down, I knew I had to try. I had to decide whether I could accept the past and move forward, or if the distance between us had already become too wide to bridge. A few days passed since his apology, and while I tried to focus on rebuilding what we had, the image of the woman in red still haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about her. She was everywhere, in every corner of my mind, always lurking in the background of my thoughts. I had tried to forget her, to push her out of my mind, but it wasn't that simple. She had been a part of his life, a part of his past, and no matter how much I tried to erase her, she was still there, a reminder of everything I didn't know about him. One evening, as I was organizing the photos on his forgotten phone again, I found another picture of her. This time, she was sitting beside him, her hand resting on his knee. The image felt too intimate, too familiar. It was almost as if they were a couple, like there was something between them that I hadn't been told about. I stared at the photo for what felt like hours. Was I imagining things? Or was there something more to their connection than just a passing fling? The questions swirled in my mind, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore them, they refused to go away. I knew I had to confront him about her again. I couldn't let this go, not when it was so fresh in my mind. I had to know what their relationship had been, what role she had played in his life. I found him in the living room, staring out the window. His expression was distant, lost in thought. I hesitated, then walked over to him. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice calm but steady. He turned to look at me, his face going pale as he saw the image on my phone. "I told you about her," he said, his voice cracking. "It wasn't what you think. She was part of that world, but it was over long before we met." But something in his voice made me doubt his words. There was more to this, and I could feel it in my bones. The conversation with him that evening left me unsettled, more so than I wanted to admit. His words had done little to ease the doubts swirling in my mind. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. If she was just a part of his past, why was she still so present in his memories? Why had he kept those photos, those reminders of a life he claimed was behind him? I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. There was a thread of doubt that I couldn't shake, a suspicion that there was more to the story than he was willing to admit. I spent the next few days searching for answers, anything that might shed light on the situation. But the more I looked, the more confused I became. Every time I thought I understood, something else would surface, something that didn't fit the narrative he had given me. It was like a puzzle, and I had only a few pieces. The more I searched for the missing ones, the more fragmented the picture became. And the more I realized that I might never fully understand the truth. Could I continue living like this, in a world built on half-truths and secrets? Or would I eventually have to confront the fact that some things were never meant to be understood? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew I couldn't stop looking. Not until I knew the full truth. The weight of it all was beginning to take its toll. I had tried to pretend that everything was fine, that I could continue living with the unanswered questions, the uncertainty. But the truth was, I couldn't. Every time I looked at him, I saw the man who had hidden so much from me, and the woman in red lingered in my mind like a shadow, always there, always just out of reach. I needed to know the truth, all of it. No more lies, no more half-explanations. If I was going to move forward, I had to understand what had happened, what role the past played in our present. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. The trust had been broken, and while I had tried to rebuild it, I realized that the foundation we had once built our relationship on was no longer strong enough to support us. I had reached my breaking point. I had to confront him, once and for all, and demand the answers I deserved. And I wasn't sure if I would be able to stay in the aftermath. It had come to this. After days of pushing the truth aside, I could no longer ignore it. I needed to confront him, to force him to face the things he had kept hidden from me for so long. I found him in the study, sitting at the desk, his fingers tapping nervously on the wood. His usual calm demeanor was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a tension I could feel from across the room. I walked up to him, holding the phone in my hands. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm, no longer the pleading one it had been before. He looked at me, his face drained of color. "About what?" he asked, though he already knew. "The woman, the photos, the life you've hidden from me." My heart was pounding, but I wasn't going to let myself falter now. He stood up slowly, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I told you everything, as much as I could. What else do you want from me?" I clenched my fists, struggling to keep the emotions at bay. "I want the truth. All of it. Why did you keep her? And why didn't you tell me about your past? Why did you hide it from me?" He took a deep breath, and for a moment, I thought he might walk away, like he always did when things got too difficult. But this time, he didn't. "I never wanted to hurt you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I didn't know how to tell you everything. How could I? You wouldn't have understood. You would have left." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. Was that really what he thought of me? "You should have trusted me," I said, my voice breaking. "If you had trusted me, maybe we wouldn't be here right now." But he didn't answer. Instead, he turned his back on me, his shoulders hunched in defeat. Maybe it's too late, I said quietly, the weight of those words settling heavily in the room. He finally turned to face me again, his eyes filled with regret. You deserve to know everything, even if it destroys us. I swallowed hard, bracing myself for whatever he was about to say. I was part of a BDSM community, he began, his voice rough. It was part of who I was back then. But it wasn't just about the physical aspect. It was about control, power, submission. I wasn't in control of my life, and it took me down some dark paths. I listened, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't what I had expected. I had never imagined this part of him. I met her, he paused. The woman in the photos, when I was deep in that world. She was someone I was involved with for a while. But that life was toxic. It was never love. And when I met you, everything changed. I thought I could leave that behind. I tried to digest his words, each one heavier than the last. So much of what I thought I knew about him had been a lie. The man I had married was not the man I thought he was. I never told you because I was ashamed, he continued, his voice breaking. I was ashamed of who I was, and I thought if you knew, you would leave me. So I buried it. I buried all of it, even the memories of her. I stood there, numb, unable to fully comprehend what he was saying. He had been hiding this all along. This dark part of his life, his past relationships, his desire for control. But now, it was out. And the question that burned in my mind was, could I accept this? Could I accept the man he had been, and still love the man he was now? I don't know if I can forgive you for this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence between us was suffocating. I couldn't bring myself to speak, and he seemed to be at a loss for words, unsure of what to say or how to make things right. For hours, we sat in that silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The weight of everything hung heavily in the air, the tension between us thick and unspoken. I couldn't stop thinking about his past, about the woman in red, about everything he had hidden from me. The question kept coming back. Was he still that man? Was he still capable of being the man I had married? Or had I been living with a stranger all this time? I could see the remorse in his eyes, but that didn't change the fact that everything between us had shifted. The trust was gone. The foundation had cracked, and no matter how hard we tried to fix it, the damage was done. I knew he was sorry. I knew he regretted everything. But what good was regret if it couldn't undo the past? He reached for my hand again, but this time, I pulled away. I couldn't bring myself to let him touch me. Not yet. Not when everything felt so fragile. I need some time, I said, my voice trembling. I need to think about everything. He nodded, his face pale. I understand. Take all the time you need. But I'll be here when you're ready. I nodded, though I wasn't sure when or if I would be ready. The silence between us lingered, heavy and thick, as I tried to figure out what I was supposed to do with the broken pieces of my life. The days that followed were a blur. I spent most of my time trying to figure out where I stood, and I found myself oscillating between anger, confusion, and a deep sense of loss. Every moment was a struggle. I couldn't stop thinking about the life he had hidden from me, the lies, the secrets, the parts of him I had never known. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I had never truly understood him. But despite all the pain, there was still a part of me that loved him. It wasn't the same kind of love I had felt before. It was different now, scarred and complicated. I didn't know what I wanted. Did I want to stay and try to rebuild everything we had lost? Or was it too late? Could I ever trust him again? Could I live with the knowledge of his past? I had been avoiding the question for days, but now I couldn't escape it any longer. I sat across from him, my heart pounding as I prepared to make the hardest decision of my life. I've been thinking, I began, my voice shaky. And I don't know if I can move past this. I don't know if I can live with the secrets. His face fell, and I saw the pain in his eyes. Please, he whispered, don't leave me. But I wasn't sure if I could stay. In the days that followed, I found myself making a decision I never thought I would have to make. I was leaving. It wasn't something I had wanted, but it was something I knew I needed. There was too much that had been hidden, too much that had been broken. The man I had married was not the man who stood before me now. And while part of me still loved him, I knew that the love I once had was no longer enough to hold us together. I packed my things in silence, not saying a word as he watched me, his face filled with anguish. He didn't try to stop me. He knew it was too late for that. "I hope one day you can forgive me," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. As I left the house, I closed the door behind me, feeling the weight of my decisions settling in. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I couldn't stay in a relationship built on lies. Maybe one day, we would find a way to heal, but for now, I had to take a step toward healing on my own. And so, I walked away, unsure of what the future would bring. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally taking control of my own life. The days following my departure were filled with a deep sense of emptiness. I had left behind a life that I had invested so much in, and I couldn't help but feel as if a part of me had been ripped away. I tried to move on, to find some semblance of peace in the chaos, but it wasn't easy. Every moment felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. The house was empty without him, and the silence that filled the space was deafening. I tried to stay busy, filling my days with distractions, but it was hard to escape the memories. The laughter, the love, the comfort I had once felt. It all seemed like it belonged to someone else now. I couldn't stop wondering if I had made the right choice. Had I given up too soon? Had I been too quick to walk away? But then, I reminded myself of the truth. He had kept secrets from me, hidden parts of himself that I couldn't accept. And maybe that was something I could never forgive. I wasn't sure if I was ready to forgive him, but I knew that I couldn't keep living in the past. I needed to move forward, even if it meant doing so alone. It had been weeks since I left him, and though I tried to focus on healing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. One day, out of nowhere, I received a message from an unexpected source. It was from a woman I had never met, but whose name was familiar. The woman in the photos. Her message was simple, but it sent a chill down my spine. "I need to talk to you. I think you deserve to know the truth." I stared at the message for a long time before deciding to reply. What could she possibly have to say? What was left to say about a past I had already walked away from? But my curiosity got the better of me. I agreed to meet her, though part of me feared what I might learn. When I arrived at the cafe, she was already sitting at a corner table, her eyes scanning the room. She looked just like the woman in the photos, but there was something different about her in person, something more vulnerable. "Are you here to tell me more lies?" I asked, my voice sharp, but I tried to keep my emotions in check. She shook her head. "No, I want to tell you the truth. About him. About everything." She started by explaining how she and my husband had met all those years ago. It wasn't what I had expected. The BDSM world they had been part of was complicated, yes, but her version of events painted a very different picture from what I had assumed. She told me how it all started, how they had bonded over shared interests, how their relationship had seemed meaningful at the time. It wasn't just about the lifestyle. It was about finding someone who understood her in a way no one else had. But as she spoke, I realized something. There was more to her story than I had ever been told. She spoke with a depth of understanding and regret that made me question everything I thought I knew about my husband's past. "The thing is," she said, her voice trembling, "he was always searching for something more, something real. But I think he was afraid of what that might mean." It was like a light bulb went off in my mind. Was he still searching? Had he ever truly found what he was looking for? Was that why he had kept so much from me? I could see the sadness in her eyes, and I wondered if she too had been running from the truth all these years. She wasn't the villain I had imagined her to be. In fact, she seemed almost as lost as I felt. "I never wanted to hurt you," she added, her voice soft. "I never wanted to come between you two. But I thought you should know that it wasn't as simple as you might think." I nodded slowly, taking in her words. It wasn't simple. None of this was simple. But it was becoming clear to me that the story I had built in my head was incomplete, and maybe it was time to stop filling in the blanks with anger and assumptions. The conversation with the woman left me with more questions than answers, but in a way, it also provided a sense of clarity. I began to understand that my husband's past wasn't as black and white as I had made it out to be. I had been so focused on the betrayal, on the lies, that I had never stopped to consider the complexity of his journey. The things he had hidden from me were not just about deceit. They were about pain, about fear, about the struggle to find acceptance in a world that didn't understand him. But understanding didn't mean forgiveness. And though I had a new perspective on his past, I still wasn't sure what that meant for my future. I went home that night with a heavy heart, unsure of what to do next. My emotions were still raw, still torn between the love I had once felt and the overwhelming sense of betrayal that lingered in the air. Could I ever see him the same way again? Could I ever trust him, knowing what I now knew about his past? I didn't have the answers, but for the first time since I left, I felt a small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for us to rebuild. Not in the same way, but in a way that was real. As the days passed, I began to take small steps toward a new beginning. I still wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew I couldn't keep living in the past. I reached out to my husband, and we met at the park one afternoon, the place where we had first fallen in love. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the trees were starting to change color, signaling the arrival of a new season. "I've been thinking," I said, my voice quiet. "I'm not sure what the future holds for us, but I know I can't keep running from it." He looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice sincere. I smiled faintly, the weight of the past still heavy on my shoulders, but there was something different now. A sense of understanding, a willingness to move forward, even if the path was uncertain. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," I said, my voice shaky, "but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see where we go from here." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to take that next step. The days after our conversation felt like a fragile truce, a ceasefire in the emotional war that had raged between us for so long. We were no longer strangers, but neither were we the couple we once were. I couldn't ignore the ache that still lingered in my heart, but there was something about his presence that made me want to believe in the possibility of healing. Maybe it was the way he seemed to try harder now, paying attention to the smallest details, always making sure to listen to what I needed. But even with all his efforts, there were moments when doubt crept in. When I would catch him looking at me with that familiar, desperate look in his eyes, and I would wonder if he was still hiding something. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I could ever truly trust him again. The past had been too painful, too complicated. But what I was beginning to realize was that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it, learning to live with it. And so, we moved forward, one step at a time, with no promises of what the future might bring, but with the hope that we could at least try to rebuild something from the wreckage. Even as we took tentative steps forward, I could feel the weight of his past looming over us. The shadows of the BDSM club, the woman in the photos. Those things had become the elephant in the room, impossible to ignore, but too painful to discuss. I had tried to bury my questions, tried to convince myself that what we had now was enough. But there were days when the memories resurfaced, when the images of him in those photos haunted me. I would catch myself wondering if he still longed for that life, if the man I was with now was truly the same man who had once sought power and control in ways I couldn't even fathom. It wasn't just about his past relationships, it was about who he had been. The man I had married had been kind, loving, and open. But this new man, the one I was trying to rebuild a life with, was still holding back. And I couldn't help but wonder if he was still holding on to something. Was it the memories? The desires? Or was he simply afraid to let go of who he had once been? As the days turned into weeks, I found myself constantly battling an internal struggle. I wanted to believe that we could make it work, that the love we had once shared could be enough to overcome the darkness of his past. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that love alone wasn't enough. Trust had to be rebuilt, and that was going to take time. We didn't talk much about the past anymore. He would sometimes bring up his old life in passing, but it was always with a sense of regret, as if he were trying to distance himself from it. I wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that he had left it all behind. But my heart wasn't so sure. I couldn't help but think about how he had kept so much from me, how he had hidden his past like a dark secret, only to have it come crashing down when I discovered it on my own. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover, more pieces of his story that he was afraid to share. And the longer I stayed in this uneasy silence, the more I wondered if I was simply fooling myself by believing everything was truly behind us. One evening, as we sat on the couch, our legs touching, I felt a sudden wave of emotion wash over me. I had been holding on to so many doubts, so much fear. But in that moment, as I looked at him, I realized that the future was still uncertain, but it wasn't completely hopeless. He had been trying in ways I hadn't always noticed. The small gestures, the quiet moments of support, the way he had been there when I needed him. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't the man I had married before, but maybe he didn't have to be. Maybe the man I was meant to be with wasn't the one I had known, but the one I could build a future with. I don't know what's next for us, I said softly, my voice breaking the silence. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see where we go from here. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with both hope and uncertainty. I'll do whatever it takes, he whispered. I'll wait for you if that's what it takes. And in that moment, I felt something shift, something that had been buried deep inside of me. Hope. A small spark, but one that was enough to keep me moving forward. The next few weeks were a quiet sort of healing. We didn't talk much about the past, and we didn't try to force a connection that wasn't there yet. Instead, we focused on the small moments. The laughter over dinner, the comfort of simply being together in silence. It wasn't easy. There were times when the memories would return, when the pain would resurface like an old wound. But instead of letting it consume me, I learned to face it, to acknowledge it, and to let it go. We were building something new. Slowly, cautiously, but it was something. One evening, as we sat outside watching the stars, he reached for my hand. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like I was holding on to the past. It felt like I was holding on to something that could be real. I know it won't be easy, he said quietly, his thumb brushing over my hand. But I want to build a future with you. A real future. If you'll have me. And in that moment, I realized something important. We weren't the same people we had been before. But maybe, just maybe, we could still find our way back to each other. It wouldn't be easy, and I wasn't sure where the road would lead, but I was willing to take that first step. As much as we tried to move forward, the past still lingered in the corners of our lives. I found myself constantly questioning how much of the old him was still with me. Could I trust him again? Could I trust myself to forget the things that had hurt me so deeply? We had our moments of peace, but there was always something that seemed to pull us back into the darkness of his past. It wasn't that he was hiding anything anymore. It was that I couldn't seem to let go of the secrets he had kept for so long. Sometimes, when he would touch me, I would think about the woman in the photos, the memories of that life he had led, the part of him that I had never truly known, and the part of him that I wasn't sure I could accept. I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to push the past aside, to let go of the anger and betrayal that still clung to my heart. But I also knew that if we were going to have any chance at a future, I had to try. But it wasn't easy. The weight of it all was overwhelming. And the more I tried to let go, the more I realized how much of myself I had been holding back, too. After weeks of avoiding the hard conversations, we finally sat down one evening to face what we had been avoiding for so long. The air between us was thick with tension, but this time, it was different. This time, we both knew that avoiding the truth was no longer an option. I think we need to talk, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes heavy with uncertainty. I know. I've been waiting for you to bring it up. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was talking to the man I had married, not the stranger whose secrets had torn us apart. He was listening, really listening, as I told him how much the past had hurt me, how much I had struggled to trust him again. I understand, he said quietly, his voice filled with guilt. I never meant for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. It was a hard conversation, full of raw emotions and painful realizations. But it was also one of the most honest conversations we had ever had. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were finally on the same page. Even after our deep conversation, I still couldn't shake the fear that had taken root in my heart. The fear of losing him, of not being able to move past the things we had been through. I still loved him, but the love felt different now. It was a love that had been tested, that had been forced to grow stronger through adversity. I would catch myself staring at him, wondering if he was the same person I had once fallen in love with, or if he was still the man with secrets buried deep inside him. But then, I would remind myself that love isn't always perfect. It's not always easy, and it's not always straightforward. It's about choosing each other, even when things are hard. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew that I didn't want to lose him. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that maybe we weren't as broken as I thought. Maybe we could find our way back to each other, even if the road was long. Slowly, we began to build a new foundation, brick by brick. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when the doubts crept back in, but we were both committed to trying. We started to spend more time together, rediscovering the things we had once loved about each other. We went on walks, had dinner at the little Italian restaurant we used to visit, and talked about the future, about what we wanted and what we feared. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't have it all figured out. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving forward, not just surviving, but truly living again. I don't know if I can ever truly erase the past, I said one evening as we sat on the couch, sipping wine. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to work for a future with you. He smiled, his eyes filled with emotion. I'll do whatever it takes. I love you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it. It wasn't a perfect promise, but it was a promise I was willing to hold on to. As much as we had tried to rebuild, there were still moments when the past would come rushing back, threatening to tear us apart all over again. I had moments where I felt like I couldn't breathe, where the weight of everything, the lies, the secrets, the pain, became too much to carry. One night, after a long conversation about his past, I found myself standing at the doorstep of our home, wondering if this was the end. The realization that maybe I had tried too hard, that maybe we weren't meant to be together, hit me like a ton of bricks. I don't think I can do this anymore, I said quietly, my voice trembling with emotion. He looked at me, his face filled with disbelief. Please don't leave. Please, don't walk away. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I could stay. The love was still there, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't enough to erase the scars we both carried. With a heavy heart, I made the hardest decision I had ever made. I walked away. The days after I left felt like a void, an emptiness that I couldn't quite explain. I had thought that walking away would bring me peace, but instead, it left me feeling more lost than ever. I spent hours alone in the quiet of my apartment, wondering if I had made the right choice. There were moments when I regretted it, when I missed him so much that it hurt. But there were other moments when the silence felt like a relief, a moment to breathe without the weight of our fractured relationship pressing down on me. I realized that I had spent so much time holding on to the past, trying to fix something that might never be fully healed. The love I felt for him was still there, but it was tangled up in so many emotions, so many memories that I wasn't sure how to navigate anymore. He had reached out, of course. Texts, calls, even emails. But I couldn't bring myself to respond. I needed space. I needed to think. And yet, as each day passed, the silence between us became harder to bear. It wasn't until a week had passed that I finally decided to pick up the phone. The messages had been constant, the calls relentless. He had tried everything, apologies, explanations, promises of change, but I hadn't been ready to listen. I didn't know what had changed in me, but that day, I felt a shift. Maybe it was the loneliness, or maybe it was the realization that I couldn't keep running from the love we once had. Whatever it was, I dialed his number, my heart pounding in my chest. Hello? His voice was tentative, filled with a mixture of relief and fear. I don't know if I can come back, I said, the words feeling heavier than I had imagined. I don't expect you to, he responded quickly, but I need you to know that I'm here. I'm not giving up on us. Not yet. There was a long silence before I spoke again. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can trust you. I understand. But I'm asking for the chance to prove it to you. His voice cracked slightly, betraying his own vulnerability. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stir something inside me. Maybe we weren't done yet. It was a fragile start, one conversation at a time. I didn't rush back into his life, but I didn't push him away either. We spoke, tentatively at first, then more openly as the days passed. Each conversation was a step forward, but there was still so much I needed to process. He told me about his past in more detail, about the shame he felt, about how he had struggled with his own desires and what they meant for our relationship. I listened, trying not to let the old wounds resurface. But there were moments when the anger would flare up again, when the pain of what I had discovered would hit me all over again. We didn't have all the answers, but we were learning how to communicate, how to talk about the things we had avoided for so long. It was slow, but it felt like progress. But even as we began to reconnect, there was a nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. Was I doing the right thing? Was I truly ready to forgive him? Or was I simply trying to make things work because it was easier than facing the truth? I wasn't sure, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. As we spent more time together, the fear began to creep back in. I was afraid that by returning to him, I was simply setting myself up for more heartbreak. I had seen how his past had shaped him, how the things he had hidden had caused so much pain. I knew that love wasn't always enough, and that the wounds we had inflicted on each other could easily reopen if we weren't careful. I spent nights lying awake, wondering if I was making a mistake. The past seemed to haunt me at every turn, whispering doubts in my ear, reminding me of everything that had gone wrong. But there were also moments of tenderness, moments when the connection between us felt real, when I could see the man I had once fallen in love with. Still, the fear was there. Fear of repeating the same mistakes, of falling into the same patterns. Could we truly move on from the past, or were we doomed to relive it? It wasn't until one quiet evening, sitting together on the porch, that I had the clarity I needed. We had spent hours talking, no longer about the past, but about the future, what we wanted, where we saw ourselves going. I don't have all the answers, I said softly, my voice trembling slightly, but I want to try. I want to see if we can build something new, something different. He turned to me, his expression filled with hope. You're willing to try? I nodded. I'm willing to try, but it has to be different. No more secrets. No more hiding. We have to be honest with each other. About everything. I promise, he said, taking my hand. No more hiding. No more secrets. In that moment, I realized something important. Love was never going to be easy. It would always come with challenges, with fears, with doubts. But it was worth fighting for. For the first time in a long time, I believed in the possibility of a new beginning. We took it one day at a time. Every day felt like a small victory, like we were building something solid from the cracks of our past. We didn't rush anything. Instead, we focused on understanding each other's needs and fears. I needed reassurance, and he needed forgiveness. Our relationship felt fragile, like glass, but I held on because I believed in us. I believed that we could make it through. We started having more fun together again, something we hadn't done in so long. We went for walks in the park, cooked dinner together, and even took a weekend trip to the coast. Each shared moment felt like a new chapter in our journey. We were learning to laugh again, to trust again. And though it wasn't perfect, it felt like we were headed in the right direction. But deep down, I still had that nagging feeling that something could go wrong at any moment. The fear lingered, but for the first time, it didn't control me. I was learning to trust my instincts, and to trust him. The progress we were making was undeniable, but I couldn't help but feel that old fear resurface every so often. The old memories of betrayal and secrets kept coming back in waves. One night, while we were sitting together on the couch, I accidentally stumbled across one of the old photos of his BDSM club days. It wasn't intentional, but seeing it triggered a rush of emotions that I thought I had already dealt with. I froze, my heart pounding. The memories of everything I had uncovered came flooding back. I tried to hide my reaction, but he saw it in my eyes. What's wrong? I don't know if I can get over it. I thought I was, but I keep seeing things, remembering things. I trailed off, my voice shaky. He reached for my hand, his grip gentle. I know, it's hard, but I'm not that person anymore. I'm not hiding anything from you. I want to be with you, not with that past. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that we could move beyond the past. But the fear of history repeating itself, was still there. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that holding on to the past was keeping me stuck. I had to let go, not just for him, but for myself. It wasn't going to be easy, but I couldn't keep living in the shadow of those photos. I couldn't let the secrets define me anymore. It was time to accept the person he was now, not the person he used to be. So, I made a decision. I made a promise to myself. One evening, we sat down together, and I took a deep breath. I've been holding on to things I can't change. I can't keep doing that. I need to move on. I need to trust you again, really trust you. His eyes softened, and I could see the weight lift from his shoulders. You don't have to do it all at once. I'm here. I'll wait as long as it takes. And that was all I needed to hear. Slowly, I started to let go of the anger, the doubts, and the fear. It wasn't instant. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Trust was a delicate thing. It was something I had to rebuild, piece by piece, but it was also something I had to give to myself. I had to trust that I wasn't going to make the same mistakes again, that I wasn't going to repeat the cycles of doubt that had plagued me before. We had become better at talking about our feelings, our fears, our insecurities. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And slowly, the walls I had built between us began to crumble. One evening, we were lying in bed, just holding each other. The weight of everything that had happened still hung in the air, but in that moment, it felt lighter. I'm scared, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared that I'll never be able to fully let go of the past. I'm scared too, he confessed, but I want to try. I want to build something new with you, something that's ours. We both knew that trust didn't come easily. It wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. But as we lay there, wrapped in each other's arms, I felt like we were on the right path. Days turned into weeks, and the relationship between us began to feel more like it once had, but with a deeper understanding. We had both changed, and that was okay. We didn't expect to return to what we were before, but we knew we could create something better. We had conversations about the future, about our dreams, and about what we needed from each other. It was clear that we weren't the same people we had been when we first met, but we were still in love. We were learning how to love each other in new ways, ways that didn't rely on the past. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of doubt. But there were also moments of joy, moments of connection that made it all feel worthwhile. And as we looked forward to the future, we knew that while the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, we were in it together. We had learned to trust, to communicate, and to forgive. And that was the foundation we needed to move forward. As time went on, I began to notice the subtle shift in the dynamic between us. We had been rebuilding, but the pressure of expectations loomed over us. I didn't know what our future looked like, but I couldn't ignore the lingering doubt that still existed. Sometimes, I would catch myself wondering if we were really ready for a fresh start, or if we were just desperately trying to fix something that was broken beyond repair. The weight of expectation, both my own and his, felt heavy. I wanted to make it work, but at what cost? There were moments when the old pain resurfaced, and I would pull back emotionally, afraid of becoming too vulnerable. Would he still be there if I needed him? Would he stay by my side if I couldn't completely let go of the past? But with each passing day, I realized that no relationship was perfect. There would always be doubts, challenges, and fears. The key was how we dealt with them. We had made progress, but the truth still haunted us. His past was still a part of who he was, and I couldn't ignore it. I hadn't fully confronted the shame and the guilt he carried from his BDSM days. I didn't want to, but I knew it was something I had to face. One evening, after a quiet dinner, I asked him the question that had been lingering in my mind. Do you ever regret what you did back then? Do you ever wish you could have been different? He looked at me, his expression serious. I do. I regret the choices I made, the things I didn't understand about myself, but I don't regret learning from it. I'm not proud of my past, but I'm proud of who I am now. His honesty hit me harder than I expected. In that moment, I realized that we both had baggage to carry, and the key was how we carried it together. I had to accept that his past wasn't something we could erase. But it wasn't the past that mattered. It was the present and the future we were building. It wasn't until I allowed myself to be truly vulnerable that I began to see how much our relationship had grown. I had spent so much time hiding behind walls, afraid of the hurt that might come if I let him in too deeply. But by doing so, I was holding us back from something better. One night, as we sat on the couch, I let my guard down. I told him everything I had been holding inside. The fears, the doubts, the insecurities. I told him how scared I was to love again, how terrified I was that I would always be haunted by the past. He listened without interruption, his eyes soft and understanding. When I finished, he pulled me into his arms. I'm not perfect, and neither are you. But we're perfect for each other. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. For both of us. In that moment, I realized that the strength of our relationship wasn't just in the good times, but in our ability to face the hard times together. The more vulnerable I became, the more I saw him as my equal, my partner, not just someone I had to protect myself from. After everything we had been through, I finally allowed myself to believe that we could have a new beginning. The journey had been long, filled with mistakes, miscommunications, and fear. But it had also been filled with growth, understanding, and love. We no longer lived in the shadow of his past. Instead, we were creating something new, something that was ours. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were truly on the same page. We talked about our future, about what we wanted out of life and love. We made plans for things we hadn't thought about before, trips we wanted to take, dreams we wanted to chase together. In that moment, I knew that I was ready to build a future with him, a future where we weren't defined by our past mistakes, but by the strength of our commitment to each other. As we stood there, looking out over the city at dusk, I made a promise to myself and to him that I would no longer let fear control me. I would no longer let the mistakes of the past hold us back from the future we could have. I love you, I said, my voice steady, and I'm ready to take this journey with you. No more hiding, no more secrets, just us. He smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face. I love you too, and I'm not going anywhere. We've made it through the hardest part. The rest is just the two of us, figuring it out together. And in that moment, I knew that whatever came next, we could face it. We had learned to love each other through the darkest times. And now, we were ready to embrace the light. The end wasn't an end at all. It was just the beginning.